I'll start building up my flows now to control my home automation system. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to create nodes to correspond to my PIR sensor and my buzzer. So these are Raspberry Pi gpio nodes. And for my sensor, it's going to be the one with the Raspberry Pi icon on the left-hand side. That's an input sensor. So I can drop that into the flow and double-click to configure. So I need to set that up on the same pin as my sensor. That's pin 7. I don't need to worry about these values for now, but I will give it a name, PIR sensor, so that I can identify the node in the flow. So now whenever that sensor is triggered, a message will be sent from that node with the raw reading of the sensor in the payload. The next thing that I'll do is set up a GPIO node for my buzzer. This time it's going to be an output node. And I'm going to use that so that I can verify whenever my sensor is triggered by beeping the buzzer. So I'll drag the GPIO node into the flow, double-click to edit, and set that one up on pin 11 to correspond to my buzzer. Now it's an output node, so the options are a bit different, but it is a digital output, and I can give it a name just like the sensor, so I'll call it buzzer. So now if I wanted to, I could connect that input node directly to the output node, and the buzzer would beep whenever the sensor is triggered, but it would beep continuously when the sensor is triggered. So instead, what I'll do is I'll search for a trigger node, and I'll drop that in between. So I can hook up the output of the sensor to the input of the trigger, and the output of the trigger to the input of the buzzer. And I can configure that trigger so that it will only cause the buzzer to trigger for a short period of time, just 200 milliseconds, so it's only going to be a short beep. And I can also get the trigger to reset. So if I set the trigger to reset whenever the value from the sensor is 0, it means that it's only going to trigger the buzzer when the sensor is activated, so when the value is 1. So now that I've done that, I can deploy this to test it out. And now whenever I activate the motion sensor, I should hear the buzzer beep. And the status of those individual nodes will update in real time. So whenever the sensor is triggered, I'll see the raw sensor value beneath the node. And whenever the buzzer is beeping, I'll see the value of the buzzer beneath the node there too. So now I know that my buzzer works, and I know that my sensor is reading. But what I want to do is see the actual message that's coming from that node. So I'll go and grab a debug node and drop that into my flow and put the message that's coming from the sensor into the debug node. And I can configure it to display the entire message. So now if I deploy that whenever my sensor is triggered, I'll see the entire message that's coming from my sensor node in the debug panel. And I can see that the payload there is 1 or 0, depending on whether the sensor has been activated or not. I'll just disconnect this buzzer while I'm working so that it's not triggering every time that I test the motion sensor. And now I can also delete that debug node now that I know what the message looks like. So the next thing that I want to do is add in a homekit node. So this homekit node, I need to first of all configure it with a homekit accessory. And I'll need to configure a pin code so that when I connect to it from my iOS device, I enter that pin code to connect to the accessory. So I can leave that at the defaults. But I will configure it as a sensor type of accessory, and I'll give it a name. So I'm going to call it a motion sensor. Now that I've set up the accessory, I can now create the instance. So it's going to be a motion sensor, and I can give it a name. So because this one's going to be connected to my front door, I'll call it my door sensor. So now that I have that HomeKit node configured, I can hook it up to my sensor. So the value from the PIR sensor is going to feed into the HomeKit node so that it will trigger and appear on my iOS device. But the thing is that I don't want to use the raw value. I don't want to use a 1 or a 0. I'm going to have to convert it into a format that HomeKit node understands. So in order to work out what keys it's expecting in the payload, I'm going to drop in a function And I'm just going to send through some dummy values. So if I set the message payload to be foobar, and then hook that function up to my homekit node, and hook my sensor up to the function so that will trigger when the sensor activates. Now, whenever the sensor activates, I should see a message appearing from the homekit node saying which characteristics, which keys it's expecting in that payload. And the one that we're interested in here is the motion detected key. So this is what we're going to need to set based on the raw sensor reading. So I'll go in and update that conversion function, set motion detected, and I'll set it to the value of the message payload that's come in from the PIR sensor. So this is going to be the raw reading from the sensor. So if we now deploy this version of the flow, whenever the sensor triggers, we should see motion sensor is set to 1 or 0 underneath the door sensor. Now this should probably be a Boolean. So what I'll do is I'll go and tweak that conversion function so that it's no longer a raw number. And the easiest way to do that is to use the negation operator. So if I negate the raw value twice, it will convert into a Boolean. So there we have it. Motion detected true or false depending on whether the sensor is triggered.
Let's add that in now to our home app on the iPhone. So what we do is we go into the home app and we can see motion sensor has popped up there. It says it's not certified and might not work. That's going to happen with all of the ones we set up for Raspberry Pi. That's okay. And we'll enter the code manually for this one. It's just all ones. Wait for that to pair. And there it is. So now this is our default room door sensor. Get it done. Whenever this triggers now, see it shows up as triggered. And now I could go to my Apple TV or to my iPad and I could set that up as part of a home automation flow.